Okay. Thank you everybody for turning out. Turning down the beautiful weather outside for this excellent talk. So I'm Dan Slater. I'm the director of the Center for Emerging Democracies, and really delighted today to have one of our postdoctoral fellows, Mira Markham, who received her PhD in history from University of North Carolina in 2025, and she'll be speaking on folk democracy in post-war Czechoslovakia. And I think you'll see right away why we were so excited as an interdisciplinary center in the study of democracy and how it emerges in different contexts, to see why we're so excited about bringing Mira into the center for her research. So very exciting topic, and we're looking forward to the talk. Mira.
Thank you. First, thanks to all of you for coming. And I'd also like to single out for particular thanks those of you who made this talk and my being here possible. Of course, Dan, and also Bill and Rosa and Dina, also for the agitation and propaganda that you've done on behalf. And I want to start with a proclamation from May 8th, 1945, the day of Nazi Germany's unconditional surrender, and the fourth day of freedom in the town where it was printed, which is Szczecin, the unofficial capital of Moravian Wallachia, a rural mountainous region in the center of Czechoslovakia. Wallachian people, after 6 years of the greatest oppression, control over our own affairs has returned into our hands, it began. It hailed the Allied armies, gloried in Germany's defeat, and presented a vision of a radical new post-war order rooted in anti-fascist resistance. United in opposition to fascism, we must be united in rebuilding our new state. All private interests must be set aside before our one great goal, which is the happiness and security of our nation. We will not allow anyone to suffer from hunger and cold in this country. We will not allow the fruits of human labor to remain an object of exploitation by one against the other. May the new republic be a republic of new ideas, a new outpouring of all our creative powers, and a new, more just social order. Wallachians, we have won the war. Now it is a matter of winning the peace. This proclamation was signed by Alois Havlík, a leading member of a local resistance group. And here it is. Havlík had recently become the head of Szczecin's Revolutionary National Committee, which took over local government after the Allies' arrival. Across Europe, as Allied troops advanced and fascist regimes crumbled, resistors, partisans, and dissenters of all kinds emerged from concentration camps and prisons, from forests and underground, to take over power at the local level. In Italy, Germany, Hungary, and now Czechoslovakia, they formed ad hoc governing bodies that took over practical duties of municipal administration and worked or aspired to build an anti-fascist order from the ground up. Occupying forces and returning government authorities pushed aside these grassroots organizations nearly everywhere. But Czechoslovakia's National Front coalition, in power between 1945 and 1948, resolved to use them as the foundation for their renewed state. In this talk, I'm going to discuss this radical experiment, which I call folk democracy, and its legacy in the region of Moravian Wallachia, which is a beautiful mountainous area in the eastern part of the Czech Republic that I've been researching and returning to for many years. So to start, I'm going to provide a little background about Czechoslovakia. At the end of the talk, I'm going to step back even further and place this research in kind of a broader European context, and also offer some more thoughts about what this seemingly kind of obscure little region and its post-war experience can tell us of contemporary relevance about democracy. So it's a long-standing nationalist narrative that the Czechs are a democratic people. Unlike their neighbors, they're not burdened by a powerful aristocracy or a history of militarism, which would kind of incline them toward authoritarianism, but rather that their traditions of tolerance and rationality make them democrats. Indeed, Czechoslovakia was the only Central European country that maintained a liberal democratic political system throughout the interwar period. But it was also in Czechoslovakia where the Communist Party took first place in the competitive elections of 1946. Running against three other parties, they received nearly 40% of the Czech vote. 2 years later, in February 1948, the communists were able to eliminate their National Front partners and take control of the government with very little public opposition, and in fact, with significant public participation. So how is this possible? During the early years of the Cold War, scholars contended that the Czechoslovak communists and their Soviet backers had implemented a plot of subversion throughout the period of the National Front's rule. They obscured their true totalitarian intentions to win the support of an essentially democratic Czech public, while simultaneously also undermining the democratic institutions that others were trying to build after the war. And they manipulated the citizenry through demagogic appeals to their base political impulses, jealousy, vengeance, selfishness, and violated norms of civility that make parliamentary competition possible. In this telling, democratic politicians and ordinary people only realized that they had been victims of a totalitarian, Soviet-inspired communist conspiracy when it was too late. Even those scholars who later challenged certain aspects of this narrative largely accepted the notion that Czech traditions were democratic ones. After 1989, the transformed political environment and increased access to sources allowed other historians to develop a different explanation of the Czechoslovak communist popularity and rise to power. This one historicized this myth of Czech democratic exceptionalism. It even argued that the myth served anti-democratic purposes by enabling individual rights to be subordinated to collective national prerogatives and obscured an exclusionary ethnic definition of the Czech nation. These scholars emphasized the Czechoslovak communist post-war embrace of Czech nationalism. And rather than presenting the communist takeover in 1948 as the negation of national tradition, they presented it as kind of the culmination of a long process of social leveling and national homogenization. They highlighted the political significance of the expulsion and dispossession of Czechoslovakia's German population, which began immediately after liberation in 1945, in rupturing social bonds and giving the communists kind of a blank slate on which to begin building a new cleansed socialist society. Not only the communists, but the entire National Front supported this ethnic cleansing. The post-war National Front may have claimed to be more democratic than its interwar predecessor, but in this telling, it was just a prelude to communist rule. There's a certain amount of truth in both these explanations. Archival evidence suggests that the Cold War scholars significantly overstated the communist political omnipotence and oversimplified their relationship to the Soviet Union. But it's true that the communists engaged in intrigue and demagoguery, and that they put their control of government ministries to their party's political ends. Similarly, the post-1989 explanation rightly highlights how the communists appealed to longstanding nationalist symbols and how non-communist political leaders participated in creating a consensus that the communists used to increase their power and support. But my argument is that while this explanation historicized an essentialist view of kind of Czech democratic values, it also essentializes ideas about democracy. So rather than measuring Czechoslovaks in 1945 by a contemporary liberal democratic yardstick, I wanted to examine how people at this time understood democracy themselves and what kind of post-war order they envisioned. And for me, that meant shifting the focus from these crowds in Prague that you see here, and that usually illustrate popular participation in historic events in this country, to a peripheral region where the post-war order held particular promise. This popular understanding of democracy that I identify in Moravian Wallachia is what I'm calling folk democracy. This term, my term, is a retranslation of a Czech phrase that was frequently used after the Second World War to describe the new political order, which is lidová demokracie, always given in English as people's democracy or popular democracy. As a piece of communist jargon, the term people's democracy ultimately came to refer to Soviet allied regimes in Eastern Europe. But in Czechoslovakia, immediately after liberation, the term lidová demokracie was used not only by communists to suggest popular self-governance consistent with vernacular political tradition. Not coincidentally, the modifier is the same in lidová demokracie as in lidová hudba or lidové umění, which is folk music and folk art. And my retranslation is not only inspired by the prominence of children in folk costume at post-war celebrations in Wallachia, or by political banners in folksy local dialect, which you also saw a lot of. It's also because, unlike the democracy of the interwar republic, lidová demokracie, folk democracy, was supposed to be unmediated by institutional bureaucracies or powerful political parties. It was supposed to be the direct product of the people's political creativity. Just like at that time, folk art and folk music were seen as the product of the people's artistic or musical creativity. And in this conception, this was the same folk political creativity that had enabled popular resistance to Nazi occupation. The region of Moravian Wallachia saw the strongest armed resistance movement in the occupied Czech lands during the Second World War. You can see in blue where Wallachia is located on this contemporary map. So it's in the easternmost part of the Czech Republic and the westernmost part of the Carpathian Mountains. Today, it takes about 3.5 or 4 hours to get to Szczecin from Prague by train. And the hilly landscape still makes travel between villages difficult and time-consuming if you don't have a car. The region's terrain and distance from centers of power allowed its resistance networks to endure despite waves of Nazi repression. But resistance was also enabled by its people's strong social bonds and traditions of neighborly solidarity. And as locals reminded me proudly while I was doing my research, also its heritage of rebellion against unjust rulers. Wallachia emerged as a discrete region during the 30 Years' War, when its shepherds and farmers launched a fearsome uprising against the armies of the Habsburg Empire. It remained a hotbed of banditry, unrest, and religious nonconformity for many decades to follow. This romantic history drew nationalist folktale and folk song collectors during the 19th and early 20th centuries, who celebrated the region for its natural beauty and its landscape and its vernacular culture, but worried that industrialization and capitalism were turning the people from proud, self-sufficient Highlanders into uprooted, sad rural proletarians. Wallachians strongly identified with the Czechoslovak state, but many of them had a reason to be dissatisfied with the political system of the interwar republic. It may have been a liberal democracy, but party elites dominated politics and left little room for local initiative or participation on the part of the rural poor. And while the country's industrial economy prospered, Wallachian villagers remained in their tiny wooden houses with dirt floors and no plumbing, living on milk and potatoes and working tiny plots of land, or serving as a reservoir of seasonal labor for more prosperous agricultural areas and urban centers. The region's small industrial base comprised precisely the sort of factories that the global economic crisis of the early 1930s wiped out: glassblowing, furniture production, textiles. The Great Depression overturned local sense of economic order. Czechoslovakia's capitulation to Hitler in 1938 and the subsequent Nazi occupation of the Czech lands in March 1939 overturned their sense of political order. Writers describe the humiliation and disorientation that prevailed among those who watched German soldiers march through the streets and buy up bread and sausages in local shops, taking advantage of the exchange rate that the new authorities dictated. But it became clear soon that the Nazis did not have the Wallachian Mountains entirely under their control. When Nazi Germany invaded the Czech part of what remained of Czechoslovakia in 1939, establishing the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, Hitler also arranged with Slovak nationalists to establish an independent German-allied Slovak state. Wallachia sat now on an international border. Farmers and villagers knew the forests and mountains far better than the occupiers did, and they could put this knowledge to their advantage. The Protectorate's economic restrictions and its rationing system did not apply in Slovakia. So Wallachian smugglers bought cigarettes, sugar, and even livestock for cheap on the other side of the border and sold them at a profit back home. And Wallachia's first resistors also drew on this local knowledge to smuggle refugees out of the Protectorate, especially former Czechoslovak soldiers and officers trying to join the army in exile. Relationships of trust remained among these resistors even after their leaders were arrested. They supported the families of political prisoners, collected information about the Gestapo's activities, and sheltered those who fled to the mountains as the war dragged on. In particular, they offered shelter to Red Army soldiers fleeing German captivity and local men avoiding labor conscription. Their activities increased when a military uprising broke out in Slovakia in the summer of 1944, and Czech volunteers began crossing through the mountains to support it. Soviet-trained partisans also participated in the Slovak uprising, and in September 1944, the leaders of one partisan brigade received orders to bring the fight to the Czech lands. With the help of local resistors, these partisans began disarming police stations and setting bombs on train tracks in Wallachia. While Nazi power remained firm in the rest of the Protectorate, Wallachia became a zone of divided control. Partisans, whose ranks included local resistors, but also these escaped prisoners of war and other refugees who had taken to the hills, relied on Wallachian families for food, shelter, and information. Their presence put them in serious danger of Nazi reprisal. Shortly after the partisan brigade arrived, the authorities sent thousands of troops to comb the area and hanged several local resistors in public. Partisans, too, executed those they suspected of collaboration or informing on them to the occupiers. Then, in the spring of 1945, an SS anti-partisan unit arrived in the region. They plundered houses, murdered villagers, and burned down nearly the entire settlement of Ploština, which one group of partisans had made their headquarters. Only liberation in early May brought an end to this terror campaign. It also brought victory to the resistance and the promise of a new political order. This order had begun taking shape even before the arrival of Allied troops in Wallachia. The leadership of the Czechoslovak Communist Party, whose members had fled to the Soviet Union, called throughout the war for the organization of national committees to both direct popular resistance and take over local administration upon liberation. The London-based Czechoslovak government in exile adopted this policy after they began cooperation with the communists and later formed the National Front. When this coalition government established itself in April 1945, it made these national committees the foundational unit of their new political system. According to the National Front's governing program, this system would, quote, establish all political life on a broadly democratic basis, ensure all political rights for the people, and carry out a merciless struggle against all fascist elements. This entailed eliminating existing district and municipal governments, which the National Front characterized as bureaucratic and distant from the people, and replacing them with national committees, elected by the people and beneath the people's continuous control. The very term National Committee evoked a long Czech tradition of revolutionary democracy. The first National Committee was founded in 1848, and locally organized national committees appeared at the time of Czechoslovak independence in 1918, before their dissolution by the new central government. Postwar national committees were to be led by, quote, those who have proven themselves in the struggle against foreign invaders and traitors, and have through their actions demonstrated and continue to demonstrate their true patriotic feeling and democratic convictions. In Wallachia, former partisans and other resistors took leading roles in new village national committees. They greeted the Allied armies as local representatives of a sovereign state. They mobilized villagers to clear roads, repair war damage, conduct security patrols, and provide liberating forces with supplies and assistance. Their members were acclaimed at public meetings to great fanfare and enthusiasm. Quote, if you justly carry out the duties with which you are entrusted, you will surely bring joy to the whole village and the whole republic, and you will build a truly new social democratic state, declared the head of the National Committee in the village of Podolov to his colleagues. A National Committee member in nearby Újezd inscribed this original poem in their book of meeting minutes. So this is the ethos of folk democracy here. Common sacrifice, self-governance, cooperation, consensus, equality. And nationalism. Truth prevails is the Czechoslovak national motto. And here we see this sort of female personification of liberty, handing the two-tailed Bohemian lion a Slavic linden branch. The author also refers to the Red Army. An alliance with the Soviet Union was a pillar of the post-war government's foreign policy. I would point out, though, that this isn't the kind of over-the-top glorification of the Red Army that we see later in Czechoslovakia. Here, the Red Army is a helper and a partner, not the nation's only liberator. And there's the reference to blood and martyrdom. Újezd and Podolov, which I mentioned earlier, were both the sites of Nazi massacres during the war's final days. The promise of a new and more just political order redeemed local sacrifice and helped villagers make sense of their harrowing wartime experiences. Wallachians believed that their resistance had transformed their region's position in the state. Leading politicians visited Wallachia for gatherings and ceremonies during the summer and fall of 1945. National newspapers printed stories about the local resistance, praising the Wallachians' heroism and loyalty despite their poverty. Pictures illustrating Nazi atrocities in Wallachia were displayed in a prominent building in Prague on Wenceslas Square. One children's author wrote a book based on the true story of a teenage boy from Wallachia who joined the partisans after his parents' arrest and execution by the Nazis. The Wallachian resistance fulfilled the Czech public's demand for stories of wartime victimhood and heroism under occupation. New National Committee members in the region hoped that their local sacrifices would legitimate their material interests and bring them special economic help. No longer just a backward periphery, Wallachia had become a site of national victimhood and heroism. The Wallachian resistance also seemed to confirm longstanding images and myths about the region and its people. These are posters advertising a gathering for former partisans in Vsetín in the fall of 1945 by the painter and partisan Jan Kobzáň, who sort of became something like the official artistic interpreter of the partisan movement. During the interwar period, he had collected and illustrated local legends about bandits, local bandits who stole from the rich and gave to the poor. After liberation, Kobzany painted the partisans in much the same way, in traditional costumes here with traditional Carpathian axes. This is the official axe of the Carpathian bandit here, or else in modern clothes with modern weapons, but still as these kind of free sons of the forest. For Kobzany, the anti-fascist resistance in Wallachia was the manifestation of a deep-rooted revolutionary local tradition. He believed that the mountains were a refuge for true lovers of freedom, escaping oppression in the lowlands, and that mountain people were the descendants of those who had chosen poverty over servitude. He wrote that they represented a truly democratic popular tradition, quote, to stand under all circumstances, one beside the other and all together, not to raise one above the other, but to protect, defend, and support the weak, fight injustice, thwart wrongs, avenge iniquity. He wrote that this was true equality, justice, and true human freedom, as the popular government of today understands it. Real, true, unfalsified democracy. It was no surprise for Kobzany that the humblest members of the nation proved to be the best citizens of the state during its darkest hour. His idealized vision of Wallachian village society could serve as a model for the post-war republic. Resistors like Kobzany and Havlik understood themselves as the protectors of folk democracy. Not only did they take leading positions in local governance, they also organized to maintain their wartime relationships and defend their own interests. The National Front's governing program guaranteed them preferential access to education, employment in the civil service, and also to property nationalized after the war. Resistors believed that this was just recompense for their sacrifices under occupation, but they also believed that it was necessary to ensure that only those with proven patriotic and democratic credentials would hold power in the new state, and that their enemies, foes of the post-war revolution, would be kept out even if they had money and connections. This became almost immediately a partisan preoccupation. Quote, "Our fight is not over," resolved a group of Wallachian resistors in October 1945. "We have put down our weapons and defeated the fascist Nazi war machine, but the remnants of fascist ideas remain." Associations representing former resistors demanded harsh punishment for accused collaborators, from leaders of the protectorate government to villagers who denounced their neighbors to the Gestapo. They insisted that nobody who had compromised themselves under occupation could maintain their position in public life. Increasingly, resistors became dissatisfied with the slow process of post-war retribution, which they associated with the simultaneous failure of conditions in Wallachia to improve. The state was not helping resistance members as they had promised, and was not helping the region as they had promised. And this was surely because of fascist elements within its bureaucracy that were thwarting the people's will. The Czechoslovak Communist Party adopted their grievances and their demands. After the Second World War, the communists had emerged as by far the best organized party in the National Front. Leading communist functionaries prioritized establishing local branches across the country and recruiting not only industrial workers, but tradespeople, farmers, and white-collar workers. 1 year after liberation, the communists had over 1 million members across the country. And joining the party wasn't simply a matter of holding a card and paying dues. Quote, "Every communist simply must be involved in some aspect of construction for the village, district, or state," district leaders in Vsetín declared. This allowed them to pursue an unusual campaign strategy during the elections of 1946. In addition to holding rallies and hanging posters, communists also carried out public volunteer labor in towns and villages. They fixed roads and spruced up public parks. Communist workers offered Wallachian farmers help repairing their agricultural equipment. And they did this all as visibly as possible to demonstrate to the people that their party was able and willing to work for the good of all, one of the values of folk democracy. This tactic was perfectly suited to a public that associated party competition with waste and corruption, and idealized what they had come to understand as the national unity born of anti-fascist resistance. And their strategy worked. As previously noted, the communists took first place and increased their vote share dramatically in Wallachia from the interwar period. This was, according to party journalists, the legacy of the, quote, "heroic tradition of the partisan fight against the Germans." The communists never failed to remind the public of their members' role in the resistance. Indeed, Wallachia's leading functionaries were old cadres who had served long terms in concentration camps, and partisans became some of its most effective activists after liberation. Both Havlik and Kobzany joined the party. Furthermore, The communists could easily fold Wallachian partisans' understanding of folk resistance into their own narrative of occupation and liberation. According to the communists, the Czech and Slovak people had wanted to fight the Germans, but they were betrayed by their own elites who feared the revolutionary potential of popular resistance to the fascist invader. Instead, these elites preferred to collaborate to protect their own property and power. They sacrificed their state and brought shame on their nation before the whole world, Communist General Secretary Rudolf Slansky declared at a meeting in 1945. Partisan resistance had redeemed the nation, he said, and given it the chance to remove these traitorous classes from power. The post-war revolution had begun this task, but its leaders had not yet completed it. Communist functionaries took every opportunity to highlight the apparent treachery of the Czech bourgeoisie and suggest that anyone who defended them might be a traitor as well. This was a powerful rhetorical weapon for inter-party battles within the National Front, and one that communist functionaries wielded effectively in Wallachia as well. They laid claim to the National Front by appealing to the values of folk democracy. This allowed the communists to prevail at the local level when a government crisis broke out early in 1948. 78 years ago, next week, as it happens, several non-communist government ministers resigned their positions to protest communist political interference with the police force. Their hope was that the president would accept their resignations and call a snap election. The communists took this opportunity to go on the attack. They described the ministers' actions as a reactionary attempt to wrest power away from the people through parliamentary trickery. They held rallies, led an hour-long general strike, and mobilized supporters across the country to establish National Front action committees, as they called them, that would remove their opponents from public life. They did this not in the name of the party, but in the name of the National Front, of the nation, of people's democracy, of folk democracy. The Czech nation declared the action committee in the Wallachian town of Valašské Meziříčí there, has never been defeated when its people have stood united and firm in their faith in the cause of justice. They added, come together in a sincere and friendly manner, as under the time of fascist subjugation. On February 25th, the president confirmed replacements, all approved by the communist leadership, for the resigning ministers. These dramatic events were initially referred to simply as the February events, and then officially as Victorious February. In the West, they were immediately denounced as a communist coup. But if they were a coup, they were a coup that occurred with the participation of thousands of ordinary citizens, even some who were not even communists. And it seemed to Wallachian partisans that the February events would enable the purge of collaborators and fascists and reactionaries that they had demanded for so long. Many of them supported the actions of the communist leadership. They appeared at rallies and joined action committees. This was expected, given the close relationship between partisan organizations and the Communist Party. What was not expected was that partisans would be among the first to organize against the communists. And that brings me to Světlana, which some call the largest anti-communist resistance organization of the Czechoslovak regime's early years. As will become clear, it's difficult to determine exactly how large it was, and it's hard to call it an anti-communist organization when many of its leaders, including Rudolf Lenhardt, who you see here, had party cards. They were members of the party. But in a few short months after February 1948, many Wallachian partisans found that their grievances had only multiplied. They protested when action committee members with no resistance credentials threw former resistors out of their positions. And they complained bitterly about the high-handed manner of many party functionaries and new governing officials. They were deeply offended when members of the newly established workers' militia began inspecting Wallachian farms for hoarded grain, that is, harassing the same poor farmers who had offered them shelter during wartime. Power had not been secured in the hands of the people as they saw it. It had been seized by one political party. The Wallachian partisans' frustrations boiled over during a meeting in a village tavern in the fall of 1948. This can't go on any longer, one participant shouted, pounding the table. You can't do anything without a communist star. The meeting's leader, Rudolf Lenhardt, found that he could not defend the party to which he belonged. Shortly thereafter, a police officer appeared at his door to warn him against allowing the partisans to conduct anti-state conversations during their meetings. This was the last straw for Lenhardt. The communists had betrayed the resistance in order to ensure their monopoly on power, as he saw it, and now they sought to silence him completely. That was when another partisan approached Lenhardt with a plan. He said that he was in contact with another resistance member who had fled to France after the February events and who was now setting up a secret political network. He had appointed Lenhard one of its lieutenants. In the name of Svetlana, as this network was called, Lenhard began recruiting his friends, securing resources, and writing and distributing leaflets. The people, he wrote, had won the right to self-government through their suffering and resistance under occupation. But demoralized by war and politically divided, they had allowed, quote, a handful of usurpers and opportunists installed by foreign interests to force their will upon them. The communists demonstrated their betrayal of the nation through the repression of the partisans, read in leaflet intended for former resistance members. They feared the resistance as legitimate representatives of the people's power, and the people looked to resistors for liberation a second time. The leaflet's symbolic value was as important and significant as their words. They made renewed partisan resistance possible by demonstrating that the Communist Party had not taken over the politics of folk democracy. After receiving a package of leaflets from Lenhard for distribution, one group of partisans resolved to take up arms once again. They survived underground for over a month in the Wallachian hills where they had fought during the Second World War. And they drew on wartime networks and local connections for food, shelter, and protection from the police as they plotted vengeance against unpopular communist functionaries. Svetlana was a serious threat to communist rule in Wallachia. Partisans were well organized, deeply connected in local society, and convinced of their right to political power. But the legacy of partisan resistance also provided the secret police with a template to ensnare real or potential resistors. Many of the network's members were caught by an agent posing as a French spy who offered them safe passage across the border. He promised them that once they were safely in the West, they could undergo military training and return by parachute to liberate Czechoslovakia once again. This conspiracy was recognizable and plausible to rebellious former partisans. It also fit neatly within the framework of official propaganda. The arrest and trial of Communist Party members, once lauded as heroes, turned the Stalinist regime's paranoid rhetoric into reality. Secret police agents made further use of Svetlana to lure many more people, some of whom had no connection to the partisan movement, into illegal activity. They blew up this genuine network of dissatisfied former resistors into a sprawling plot that illustrated the dangers supposedly threatening the Republic. Hidden enemies apparently were everywhere, including within the party itself. Trials of Svetlana's members were held in theaters in 3 different towns. Lenhard was sentenced to death, and dozens of Wallachian farmers and villagers received harsh prison sentences. Newspaper articles about them appeared under headlines like, "We won't allow the Republic to be subverted," and "Our people will settle scores with all spies and wreckers." Now that these enemies had been unmasked, one article concluded, the people of Wallachia could finally enjoy peace and build a prosperous future. Svetlana was part of a Cold War story of subversion, espionage, and conspiracy. Even American readers could learn about the trials if they made it to page 12 of the New York Times. Folk democracy did not prevail over party dictatorship as Lenhard trusted it would, but its legacy nevertheless remained. Having seized power in the name of the people, the communists continually had to build consensus behind their plans and initiatives and demonstrate that they were consistent with popular tradition. This required enormous effort on the part of both party leaders and lower-level functionaries, and it often led to great confusion among representatives of different institutions within the party state. Since the end of the Second World War, for example, the Czechoslovak Communist Party had denounced anti-clerical politics and even embraced aspects of the nation's religious heritage. This was essential for their popularity in Wallachia, where priests retained their positions as figures of public authority. After February 1948, the communists attempted to maintain this line while simultaneously also trying to eliminate the independent influence of the Catholic Church and while conducting a propaganda war against the Vatican, which had aligned itself firmly with the West. While the communist leadership ordered the persecution of the church hierarchy, they also directed local officials and functionaries to curry favor with rank-and-file priests. To demonstrate their acceptance of Catholic faith and practice, and to co-opt the political and social force of religion for their party's power, the party state sponsored the repair of church buildings. They also even organized official pilgrimages to Svatý Hostín and Velehrad, both places of devotion for Wallachian Catholics. But this antagonized and insulted many clergymen and rank-and-file believers, and it also confused old cadres who understood religion as reactionary and priests as their political enemies. Still, other Wallachian communists went further in their defense of religious authorities and practices than their leaders would accept. And those priests who chose to cooperate with the communists legitimized the party's claim to lead the people and protect their traditions. But they also acted of their own accord. One of Wallachia's most prominent patriotic priests, as these pro-communist priests were called, was one Father Horak. He was a great asset for the party state. He drove a tractor for the collective farm, and he headed the local branch of a state-linked mobilization organization called the Protectors of Peace. But he also used his position to make his own demands of the party state's representatives, including for the extensive renovation of his church. And he intervened on behalf of his parishioners when they were persecuted. 1 year after the Svetlana trials, he helped the relatives of 30 defendants from his parish appeal for presidential amnesty. Horak composed a letter himself on their behalf, and he placed the district action committee's stamp on their petition. And the stamp is like a symbol of official power in Czechoslovakia. It's very powerful. He also secured stamps from local officials and even from several village Communist Party organizations. Horrified district party functionaries hid these documents from their higher-ups, who had to scramble to rein in both their rural comrades and the priest without drawing attention from the public. So the Communist Party state's contradictory commitments left them continually putting out political fires of this kind in Wallachia. Folk democracy required the communists to embed their power in the village, relying on local actors to carry out orders from above. And these locals carried out their orders not only as instruments of communist rule, but as members of a close-knit village community and as people with their own personal interests and motivations, ones which very often conflicted with those of the party state. Communist appeals to folk democracy legitimized their power, but then undermined it and prevented it from consolidating. Folk democracy proved incompatible with rigid, bureaucratic one-party rule. Communist Party dictatorship could not offer Wallachia the self-governance it promised, but the communists could offer something else, economic uplift. A rising standard of living allowed local communist leaders to abandon their commitment to folk democracy. In the years after liberation, and continuing and even accelerating after February 1948, the government succeeded in improving roads, electrifying villages, establishing bus routes, and building schools and housing estates. Poor village women could now give birth in hospitals, and their sons and daughters could pursue an education. By the mid-1950s, this was how the party state was able to legitimize its power. When elections to national committees, non-competitive elections, were held in 1954, communist functionaries collected and publicized stories about poverty, unemployment, and hunger during the interwar period. They used these stories to highlight the region's progress under their party's rule. They did not speak about resistance to fascism. Later on, in the 1970s, partisan resistance did become a major theme of official propaganda, but it was not presented as a local movement, but rather as one inspired by the Communist Party under the leadership of the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, the anti-fascist resistance remained a reservoir of political potential in Wallachia. And to illustrate this, I want to end with a picture from Brlov, which is one of the partisans' wartime strongholds. There's a little museum there about the resistance, which I visited while I was doing my research, to see the artifacts there, but also to talk with the man who runs it about the partisans and about how people remember them today. Before I left, he asked me if I had noticed this barn as I had walked in from the bus stop with this faded inscription. And I said that I had, but that I couldn't make out what it actually said. It says, "Naše mládež nezradí," which means our youth won't betray. This implicit pride and loyalty and talk of betrayal are very 1945. But as I learned, the words are from 1968, the time of another foreign occupation, this time by the armies of the Warsaw Pact. And as I interpreted it, in Brlov, these words had a very specific meaning, which was our youth won't betray, just as their parents hadn't. So I'd like to briefly, as I promised, to step back from Wallachia and draw some broader conclusions. The Wallachian Hills, as I said, were not the only place in Europe where anti-fascist resistors organized upon liberation to shape a new political order, and it was not the only place where they were disappointed. This moment has received surprisingly little attention from historians, But my project, my research suggests its enduring importance in shaping political development at the local level, even after other authorities succeeded in marginalizing resistors' direct participation in governance. It also demonstrates that the legacy of anti-fascist struggle was not as easily appropriated by communist regimes as people who study Eastern Europe often assume. The political aspirations born out of this struggle, which I'm calling folk democracy, inspired resistance to party dictatorship and hampered communist plans. And to challenge myself today, I'm going to do the thing that I usually avoid doing, but that I promised briefly to do at the beginning of the talk, which is to draw contemporary conclusions. A lot has been said, and a lot can be said about crises in democratic states today, both here and in Central Europe and elsewhere. And I thought about this while doing research and writing about these events, and I think it also probably influenced me sort of below the level of consciousness as well. For what it's worth, I've come to think about this kind of current crisis as at least partially a crisis of participation. When ordinary people, poor people, people far from centers of power are cut out of processes of political decision-making that affect them, when their political influence is distrusted and feared, this distorts democratic politics. It creates sources of support for movements and leaders whose commitment to democracy is shaky, and that offer people a kind of pseudo-participation through charisma or through spectacle that degrades real democratic self-governance. So I think that a solution to this crisis should take into account or should incorporate the spirit of the proclamation in some sense that I started with. In particular, the desire for a more just and equal order brought about through a new outpouring of the people's creative powers. And concluding with this proclamation also gives me the excuse to end with its final line, which is victoriously forward into a more joyous, I screwed it up. Okay, victoriously forward into a new and more joyous life.
I think if there are any questions you have, I can see behind me. So.
Okay. I would love questions of any kind. Should I put up some of the slides?
Sure.
I don't know. I escaped out of it.
You promised fabulous photos and you delivered. I mean, there's some
Really?
incredible visuals.
Great.
Totally.
Right, which is, I don't know.
Absolutely. Anything
This one is my favorite. This is
a good one.
yes, yeah.
Can I ask a question about religion? So I'm sort of thinking about the source and just situating Czechoslovakian communism in the region a little bit here, right? So I guess my perception of these things, we think about, by the 70s, 80s, sort of the waning days of these communist regimes in Central Europe, there's sort of in my brain kind of a spectrum of from reform to hardline. And that the Hungarians seem to be kind of most willing to experiment with some kind of both economic, political liberalizing reforms. The Poles under serious duress from Solidarity, somewhere in between, and then the Czechs were seem like the real hardliners. Like this is sort of the perception I had, right? But then the question to me then is religion a little bit of a different story from that? Because to the extent that I certainly think of both the Polish and Hungarian cases, that there's this notion, at least in political science, that there were still the strong religious sentiment that was sort of frozen, right, or kind of beneath the surface, which reemerged after the fall of communism, but couldn't play much of a role in politics. And the impression I got from you was that there was a way, it was a little bit more absorptive in a sense, that there wasn't maybe the same, or maybe it's before 68, I don't know, but there seemed like less of a direct bone-on-bone kind of clash between the party and forces of religion. Maybe that's only in Wallachia, maybe that's just a misimpression, but what would you say about sort of the relationship between the regime and religion, and whether or not that might complicate the way we think about the general reformism or hardline character of the Czech Communist Party?
Yeah, so I guess I think that the role of religious dissent and religious protest in the events of 1989 and of like dissent in general in Czechoslovakia are often kind of underplayed and understudied because of the focus on Havel and this group of dissenters. Particularly in Slovakia, the religious dissent was very strong, but also in places like Eastern Moravia, where Catholicism was a very had a very important sort of presence. There was this organization of kind of cooperative, or they call them patriotic priests, which continued in kind of various different forms all the way till the end, and that allowed the regime to kind of co-opt religion in a certain way that continued all the way till the end. And I know that in kind of the circles of religious dissent, they were often struggling with these other circles. I don't know that I would characterize it as kind of a direct struggle like this, but rather as kind of forces that were interacting to push kind of these kind of streams of dissent and protest forward. Yeah.
How much of the writing of the history of Czech Republic and Czechoslovakia was, I mean, the communists won, right? And so they've written the history. How much of this history, I mean, are there other people besides you not rewriting, but rediscovering the history post-war to 1968 to 1989 and to now?
I think it's funny. So the Czechoslovakia, and particularly the Czech part of Czechoslovakia, has received much more attention from historians in English-speaking countries than one would imagine, given its size, right? And a lot of this has to do with kind of the Czech-German conflict and the way that it's served as sort of like a laboratory of national development and a way for people to study how national consciousness develops in the 19th and 20th centuries. And part of it also has to do, particularly with people who are studying the communist period, with this idea that Czechoslovakia was this developed, industrially developed, wealthy democratic society where the communists took over. And so if you were a scholar in the 1950s or 1960s and you looked at what was going on there, you looked at Czechoslovakia and you saw Britain, right? You saw France, Italy, the United States even, right? And so you were looking for lessons, like political lessons about what to do. And Czechoslovakia seemed much more, I guess, kind of like more of a parallel than a country which may have been more kind of less industrialized or had a stronger tradition of like authoritarian rule or something like that. It was something that you saw as being a kind of parallel in that way. So it's received a lot of attention. And then I think that, again, in the 1990s, people returned to this question about how it was possible that the communists seized power in this kind of in this democratic society, or this presumably democratic society, and they looked at these ideas about nationalism, and they saw these continuities. I think what I'm trying to do here is, rather than look at something from kind of this top-down sort of like a national perspective, and how do we understand like what the Czech nation did or what the Czechoslovak nation did, instead to say, okay, how did this society, this rural society in these villages, respond to these political events, and how did they participate in these political events on this kind of very everyday level? That's part of what I'm trying to do in this project, I would say. Yeah.
Made the communist period somewhat. I have always found resistance in Czechoslovakia very long time.
Yeah, absolutely. And there have been like a lot of debate. I mean, another argument that people made was that, particularly during the 1950s, the communist rule in Czechoslovakia was more severe because it had to be, because the democratic traditions were so strong, and so they had to like repress even more. And historians have kind of looked into this and they said, okay, this is actually a little overstated. Like they were repressive, but like Hungary was also repressive, so was Poland, etc. But I mean, the other thing I would say is that for the people involved, both for the communists, for example, in 1945, 1948, who saw themselves as bearers of the nation's democratic traditions, they saw themselves as people who were like progressing further with the democratic traditions. They called them progressive traditions, right? And then in 1968 as well, these reform communists saw themselves as improving on both the interwar republic, which brought political freedom, and the communist regime, which brought this economic sort of justice and equality and so forth, and combining them and again, furthering the nation's sort of democratic traditions in this way. So this is something that was always present for them. Yeah.
This isn't really a question, but I couldn't help but draw parallels throughout your presentation of the Japanese government in Korea's collapse with the partisans as well as the Soviet-backed partisans and the American forces that eventually landed, and how there was a sort of folk democracy that kind of established itself, but was co-opted by the Soviet-backed forces and then the eventual American-backed forces. I don't know, it was just interesting.
That's fascinating. I would love to learn more about that. Thank you for
very stupid and complicated.
No, I mean, if you could like suggest anything to read for me about that, I would be like very interested in that.
It's been a couple of years, I'd have to look.
Yeah, no, definitely.
It's a lot more than Korea. I mean, you had partisans and you had anti-Japanese fascist resistance all over East Asia, Southeast Asia. So a lot of these parallels that are worth just at least starting to ponder a little bit.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
I had sort of like two related questions that are both sort of surrounding the legacies of the partisan resistance. And I'm sort of thinking about it for clarification. I study Emilia-Romagna in Italy and conflicts there. So
okay, cool.
Honestly, kind of a place like imagine Wallachia if the communists never took power in Prague. It's kind of like shorthand there. And sort of like I had one question thinking about how broad-based should we think of the legacy of the partisan resistance in perhaps like Wallachia specifically, or Czechoslovakia in general in the post-war period, in comparison to state communist rule itself, because one of the things that I think about, there is a great level in where I study official like remembrance and fondness towards the myth of the resistance and towards many martyrs and post-war heroes. But there is also this sort of resentment. You talk about this idea of like partisans getting angry, like, why did I lose my like good position in the new state regime? I'm one of the good guys. I fought the war. Right. These people didn't. But you often see like in the post-war like economic and political structures, this resentment towards like, okay, you shot a gun. That doesn't mean you can run a cooperative. That doesn't mean you can like run a government. Please get out of your role. And this goes on into the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. And relating to this, considering like, obviously Czechoslovakia goes through a 45-year experience of like one party communist rule and then democratic restoration. How has that trajectory affected post-Cold War remembrance to the partisans? Is it weird because they were disproportionately communist? Is it weird because they ended up having a weird relationship to the communist regime? Like, how does that follow in the present day?
Yeah, okay, so to answer the question about memory first, yeah, it's really weird. It's really weird and really complicated. And what makes it even more complicated is that the relationship, or the relationship that the memory that individuals have of the partisans that they like maintain within their families and within their private circles is not always the same as what's happening in the public. Right. And different people in the area had different experiences with the partisans. Some of them had, quite positive experiences and they saw themselves as sort of participating in the same struggle. Some saw themselves as becoming kind of heroes, not by their own choice. Right. And some saw themselves as victims of war and see the partisans as being like a destructive force. Right. And the fact that the partisans were glorified after the war, and then this glorification sort of really picked up in the 1970s and 1980s, and really became this kind of legitimizer of communist rule and also of Soviet hegemony. Because the idea was that because these Red Army soldiers who were refugees, right, they weren't like these people who would come in to like protect the people of Czechoslovakia from the Germans. They were people who were running, right, from these POW camps, but they were portrayed as being kind of like the vanguard of liberation, and kind of a proof that that Czechoslovakia needs the Soviet Union, right, and that Soviet power and Soviet domination of Czechoslovakia is like warranted, and that communist rule, one party rule, is justified also because it was portrayed as being kind of through this communist inspiration. And the resistance was much less coordinated than that. It was much more decentralized than that, right? And the idea that it had like one sort of ideological like inspiration is kind of it's just not the case, right? When you look at what was actually going on kind of at the ground level during the war. And then during the 1990s, this interpretation, this sort of propagandistic, like late socialist interpretation, was kind of turned on its head, and then partisans were presented as basically these like hoodlums and murderers and like wild men who just like screwed things up and like made the Nazis mad and got people killed for no reason. And this is consistent with some kind of private memories of the partisan resistance that were preserved by some families, right? But it also runs counter to the way that other people in the region see themselves as really having fought, you know, and really take pride, and it has become something of kind of a mark of regional identity, right? As being like this is what distinguishes us from the rest of the country, right? So we can fight, and so it's very complicated. And now I think things are starting to settle down a little bit. Like I said, the people, the man who runs this museum, they're a local kind of amateur and professional historian of the museum, people who are really doing great work trying to preserve this history. But it is very complicated. And then the question about partisans in politics, like immediately after the war, like how they got their legitimacy. So a lot of them left. They did not last long in politics at all. And part of this is because the communists, these old communist cadres, basically pushed them out and were beginning to push them out, like in 46, like very early, because the way they saw it, you know, they had been studying Marxism, Leninism, and here come these guys who are kind of, you know, had just spent some time in the woods, and they're saying like, we have the right to do it, you know, and like, who are you? And also because a lot of them, you know, did not turn out to be good, like actual administrators, right? This guy Havlik, who wrote this great proclamation, turned out to be an absolutely terrible manager of the District National Committee. He turned this internment camp over to his crazy friend. His crazy friend was doing all kinds of horrible things to the prisoners there. There was embezzlement. It was you know, this is not, and people said when they were kind of investigating him, you know, this partisan struggle is not necessarily great preparation for like peacetime politics. But nevertheless, there was this kind of assumption after the war, right, that the war had been this kind of like purifying fire, and that it had demonstrated like who has the right character and who doesn't. This is a great myth for the partisans, right?
Outpouring of creative powers and bureaucratic administration are not exactly the same spirit, right?
Yeah.
So, you know.
Yeah. But I mean, the problem, I suppose, is like institutionalizing, right, this kind of revolutionary spirit, right, and this revolutionary fervor. And I think this is probably something that you see. I mean, you saw it after 1989, right? The kind of democratic ferment, and like what happens when this is translated into a new governing order. Tough stuff.
We're at 5. This is really an amazing talk, Mira. Thanks so much for this. Thanks everybody for coming out. Terrific.